So good morning, everybody. I'm just going to wait a couple of seconds to let you all enter the room. We have 280 people registered this morning, so just going to give it a minute or so, less than a minute, for most of you to enter the room, and then we'll get underway. Okay, good morning and a very warm welcome to the first EPC update of 2021, our regular look at the key developments in and around the European Union in the time of the COVID-19 pandemic. And can I take this opportunity, please, to wish you all a very happy or a happier new year than 2020 was. My name is Jacki Davis. I'm a senior advisor to the EPC, and with me this week, as always, are Janis Emmanouilidis, Director of Studies at the EPC, Fabian Zuleeg, the Chief Executive of the EPC, but I am particularly delighted to welcome our special guest today, Herman Van Rompuy, President of the EPC and, of course, President Emeritus of the European Council, as we discuss the EU in 2021, taking stock and challenges ahead. As always, this will be a totally interactive session. There'll be questions from me and later on, I hope, from all of you, as we consider where we are now and where we are going, where we need to be going. Housekeeping before we start. Your microphones are muted at the moment. If you want to ask a question, click on the Q&A button if you on the hands raised button if you wish to take the floor orally, and if you want to write your question, put it in the Q&A box, please, not the chat box, the Q&A box. And please, my usual plea, please keep your questions brief so I can see at a glance what it is and who it's for. So let's get underway, and we're going to start. I've asked President Van Rompuy to give us some opening thoughts to set the context for our discussion. Then I'll broaden out to Fabian and Janis to discuss what he said. So, President Van Rompuy, great, as I said, to have you with us. Thank you so much for finding the time, as always. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Jacki, for giving me the floor. As usual, I prepared a text, so I will read my text, but it will not be boring, so I can assure you that. After all the unexpected events of the last 13 years, I wonder if it still makes sense to talk about the expectations for the new year. Expect the unexpected. So if I have to talk about 2021, I would first like to say something positive about last year, how politically incorrect this may be. Last year was a disaster for the Europeans, but not for the European Union. We saw, first of all, an uncommon expression of solidarity and future orientation when the European Recovery Fund was created in July 2020. It is not an instrument of relaunch like in the past, where money was blindly pumped into the economy. Now, 60% of the new resources go to climate and the digital transformation. It is not a return to normal, not a return to the business as usual. Moreover, the European Council boosted the targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions a month ago. Now implementation awaits. And this shows how the Green Deal remains the major project of this Commission. Generally speaking, the Member States have the task of realizing the ambitions for economic recovery and climate change. It's a big responsibility on the shoulders of the Member States. We saw political courage in the Union to give up budgetary and monetary taboos. Governments played a central role both in health and in the economy by supporting firms and jobs. Initially, the role of the EU institutions was limited as far as health was concerned, simply because the EU was hardly competent. The European Union is not a super state. So this became clear in the spring of this year. In any case, politics returned. Market thinking is no longer dominant as in the last 40 years. The pandemic also showed that we cannot live and survive without respect for science and expertise. And hopefully the climate skeptics understood that. Politics must be science-proof. But it is not because politics will play a more important role that everything is political. Without a vaccine, the result, by the way, of research inside the Union, without a vaccine, we would have ended up in the vicious circle of health restrictions, fewer infections, relaxation, a new wave of infections, and then new restrictions, without any perspective or hope for sustainable improvement. So imagine this corona crisis also without digital technology. Economically, we would have found ourselves in the 30s, and on a human level, this so-called century of loneliness would have been even more tragic. So I spoke about positive developments. All this, of course, does not make us forget that we are on our way to 2 million deaths as a result of the pandemic. 2021 will see a recovery of the economy that is first vaccine-induced. Uncertainty among consumers and investors will fade away so that they can start to spend their savings. The budgetary efforts of national governments and of the Union will be rolled out. Interest rates will remain low for a long time to come, so that the financing of public debt, which has risen very sharply, will not be a problem for many years to come. The resumption of the economy will take place while a negative development will occur through the gradual reduction of support measures and the resulting bankruptcies, unfortunately, and job losses, unfortunately. It is to be hoped that the ideologues will not speak too soon of the rapid reintroduction of budgetary rules, or will start overwarning of the threat of inflation. Part of the economy, especially the part that lives from mobility, hospitality, and events, will have to adapt its business model to post-corona times. And climate policy, by the way, will not leave the low fuel costs of airplanes untouched. Many low-skilled jobs will disappear and will have to be replaced elsewhere by jobs that require more skills. This dichotomy in society will be further exacerbated so that many may feel abandoned and attracted by populist slogans. In fact, the normal political game in Europe will resume in full once the common enemy, the virus, will no longer be there. The polarization will quickly resume, and hopefully not too strong, in Italy and in France, which are most vulnerable to it. Internationally, of course, there is the big bright spot, the arrival of a new American president. In this sense, there is a beneficial return of normality. Multilateralism will first be restored in terms of climate, the greatest challenge for humanity. Differences of opinion within the Western camp will once again be discussed instead of the unilateral, what the French call, fait accompli. The Union must remain as united as it was at the time of the Brexit negotiations. The concept of strategic autonomy remains as topical even after the American elections as it is today. Therefore, it is a good thing that the EU has concluded an investment agreement with China on a political level. But again, this strategic autonomy or sovereignty must be achieved in many fields. In the fields of digital technology, defense, telecommunication, strategic sectors, medicines, migration flows, food, etc. The Union cannot be a global actor without greater autonomy. As elsewhere, the internal agenda inside the Union will dominate politics. The legislation proposed by the Commission on digital sovereignty must be adopted. The Commission proposals on migration and asylum still have a long way to go, inter alia bearing in mind that Hungary will have elections in 2022. This is once again about solidarity. Solidarity without which there can be no real European Union. We will have to see, by the way, also how firm the agreement is on respect for the rule of law and for democracy. Hopefully, this will be equally important for the voters in the two countries. A good part of the political agenda is the implementation of previous decisions, much of which were taken under the German presidency of the Council. This leads me to say that the end of Chancellor Merkel's mandate this year will be the end of an era in the Union. No one can take over that role today in the European Council. In times of crisis, this will make itself felt more than in so-called normal times. But, ladies and gentlemen, does normal still exist in this time of transition? Transition to the unknown, by the way. The conference on the future of Europe should take off this year. It's a difficult exercise, a mixture of bottom-up and top-down, a mixture of listening to the citizens and of leadership. Without working on a new treaty, lessons can be learned from the experience of recent years. I give 3 examples. Further restricting the rule of unanimity, certainly in foreign policy, the limited European competences in healthcare, and the way of enforcing European values. We will not miss our British friends in the EU 27 when we continue to work on strategic autonomy. They would only work against us. The time when the single market is the Union's only binder is over. Here too, there is the return of politics. Of course, the Union and the UK must work together where they can, without us having to pay a price for that. I fear that Brexit has been the last geopolitical act of Great Britain in its history. From now on, it will be absorbed by an internal agenda, first and foremost, the survival of the UK itself. The Union is also the sum of the member states. Political and social instability at the national level also has a major influence on the Union as such. It cannot be strong, the Union, I mean. It cannot be strong if the member states are weak. 2020 was a year in which the fight against the virus did not allow for the normal political game. The structural weaknesses of national governments, with sometimes more than 10 having minority coalitions, have not all disappeared. The underlying causes of populism, unemployment, insecure jobs, inequalities, irregular migration, a lack of good and fair governance, they remain topical. The Corona time has even reinforced some developments. Of course, Trump's defeat has been important, but national societies in Europe are following their own course, not looking all the time on what's happening in the rest of the world, and even not looking at what's happening in their neighborhoods. It's also about more than just the economy. We must not forget that. And hopefully, the pandemic has a positive legacy in the sense of more mutual solidarity. We saw a lot of solidarity during these Corona times. A legacy in the sense of more respect for care, more respect for community goods, the value of expertise and science, also a form of moderation or a more sober way of life. We will see. We'll see what kind of return, so-called, to normality we will have. And finally, a few days ago, I read some articles that strengthened my inclination towards hope, without making a new case for global optimism. And yet, hope is not forbidden, not even in 2021. Ask Joe Biden. Hope is not forbidden. I wish you all a happy and even a happier new year. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. President, for that very inspiring start to our new year and that mixed picture. You highlight, very struck by what you said right at the beginning. It's been a disaster for Europeans, but not for the EU. And you highlighted some of those positives coming out of the pandemic, question mark about whether they will persist, as you say, in the post-COVID period. So, but alongside the challenges, maybe also a moment of opportunity to seize some of those challenges. Let's dive straight into the discussion. And let me start, I want to start really with that broad picture. You've given us your assessment of where we are now and the challenges ahead. Fabian, would you agree with Herman's assessment of where we are and this mixture really of some positives alongside the terrible negatives of the last 9-10 months and the challenge ahead?
Thanks very much and Happy New Year to everyone from me too. It's good to see so many people joining us today. Yes, I think there are signs of hope, but there are also very many challenges on the horizon. And I think the one thing I'm trying to keep with my normal pessimistic outlook, the one thing I would say is if we look ahead, what really concerns me is what is going to happen to our economies once we are emerging from the immediate health crisis. In the immediate aftermath of the health crisis, yes, there are many things we have to do now, and they have a negative impact on the economies. But it has also meant that, for example, we have had schemes to support employment in most countries. We have had many schemes to support businesses throughout this period. But the reality is that these schemes will have to be cut back. They will have to stop at some point in time. I think it is inevitable that we see a strong rise in unemployment, which will also have political implications. We have to deal with this overhang of state aids, in particular in some countries, where we are financing a large part of the economy through public money and essentially through raising additional debt. And this debt overhang is also something we will have to deal with. Herman is right, interest rates will remain low, but we are talking not only about public debt, we are also talking about very significant accumulations of private debt. If we look at some businesses, they have accumulated debt and they continue to accumulate debt. The situation isn't over yet. So I fear that we're facing a very significant economic challenge, most likely some form of recession with significant unemployment rising. And I think it is now the time that we have to start thinking about how we deal with that situation, also recognizing that some of the tools we have used up to now are not going to be effective. At the same time, I think what Herman also mentioned in terms of the rise of populism, I would add to that maybe to the rise of negative nationalism. The my country first, looking inward rather than outward, I think is something which we're going to see across the world, but it's also something we're going to see in Europe. And there we need to find ways of dealing with that within a union where we are dependent on each other, where cooperation has to be the norm rather than the exception. So I think there are many challenges. That doesn't mean we can't address them, but I think we need to start thinking about how we're going to deal with these rather negative and rather large scale impacts we're going to see later on in the year.
Thank you. So Janis, Fabian, really echoing there, this point about the underlying causes of populism haven't gone away, even if we saw at the height of the crisis a sort of, if you like, suspension of normal hostilities in a way. Herman Van Rompuy saying the polarization will quickly resume. We'll be back to politics as normal. Would you agree with that, or do you have some hope that alongside these very tough economic challenges and this looking inward that Fabian has pointed to, there are also positives that have come out of the cooperation in the pandemic and so on?
Sorry for this simplistic first thought, but I think we need to be very cautious. Both Herman and Fabian are right. There are some reasons for optimism, but there are also challenges of a magnitude where we're not aware of how we will be able to manage them in future. And I think that something which Herman said in his introductory remarks is very correct. Expect the unexpected. We should be very humble when we try to make a prognosis of what will happen over the next 12 months, especially in the beginning of a year, and we always have this tendency to look forward. I think we need to be very careful because we've seen that already for now 12 years, we're in a state of, let's call it a perma-crisis, one crisis after the other, which we need to manage. And who's to say what is going to happen in the next 12 months? But having said that, I think my overall judgment is that over the past year, it has been a horrible year, as has been described by both Fabian and by Herman. However, the EU has rather managed the crisis rather well. If you look into the milestones of what was achieved over the past 10, 11 months, many of these things would have been unthinkable 2 years ago. If you look into the big bazooka of the ECB, if you look on the compromise of July, December on the MFF and the new Next Generation EU Recovery Fund, which includes also compromise on the conditionality mechanism, by the way. These were things which probably nobody would have thought was possible 2 years ago. And I could go on with a list of achievements which we've seen, which makes me more optimistic than I probably was in February, March of last year. Because when you were thinking of what potentially the most negative scenario could look like in terms of development in reaction to the COVID-19 crisis, you could have thought of a much more negative scenario. Now, I'm not saying that we are in a positive scenario. However, things could have been much worse. And I think the main motto which we followed, and I think we should continue following that, is that expect the worst in order to avoid the worst. And I think early on, reacting to developments, especially with respect to the health crisis, this is another lesson we got from the past months. We should have been harsher in our reactions in September. We should have been harsher in our reactions in November and December in order not to have such a second and a third wave. So there's a lot we can learn from the positiveness of the past 10, 11 months, but there's a lot of caution with respect to what will happen, and there's no reason to relax.
Thank you very much. And Herman, if I could come back to you on something you said, we've discussed at Update many times how the EU prepares for a sort of new normal post-COVID. But you said in your remarks, you asked, does normal still exist in times of transition? I wonder what you meant by that. And if it doesn't, what the implications are if we are to, as Janis says, expect the worst to avoid the worst.
Yeah. Difficult to be more explicit about what the new normal should be. In any case, there will be, if the vaccine operation is a success, there will be some return of normality. shops, restaurants, hotels are opening again. People go to work, meet each other, and so on and so on. That will come back. But it will not come back always in the same way. And I mentioned for some sectors what will happen. And Fabian was right when he spoke about the level of public and private debt. By the way, not only in the European Union, you have the same phenomenon in the United States, in Japan, even in China. You have this huge accumulation of private and public debt. So there will be a return of normality, but not for everybody and not in all the sectors in the same way. But at the same time, and that also was part of my introduction, the European Union and also the member states are working for not a new normality, because that is only playing with words, but for a new reality. And I am referring, for instance, to climate change. What we are doing now with this objective of minus 55% less greenhouse gas emissions in 2030, instead of the minus 40% that we put forward when I was still president of the European Council in 2014, that is a real game changer for the economy as a whole. So we are working ourselves to a new reality and not to restoring the normality, so to speak. So this is, as always, full of nuances and much more complicated than it is. But if you allow me, Jackie, to add one word, and now I'm speaking not as a politician or as a former economist, but I'm very curious to see how the population will react also. What will be left about this, with these hopeful signs of solidarity I saw during the Corona crisis? What will be left of this new interest in nature and in this, let's say, this overall view of the way of life we have? Some cynics say, oh, you will see nothing will be left, and we will go to normality and without any changes, even in the behavior or the mindset of people. I'm not so sure. Of course, we have to wait and see. But this is also part of what I meant to say about a return to normality. Life, public life, the economy, the society is also based on what's happening inside the hearts and the minds of people. Is there a legacy of this Pandora crisis, of this pandemic, of this Corona crisis? Is there a legacy in terms of behavior and mindset?
And question, is there also a legacy in terms of the attitude of politicians towards cooperation in Europe and so on? Janis, I know you want to come in, but Fabian, I wanted to pick up on that because I wanted to link it to what you said about what happens to the economy now, because Herman making very strongly that point there about it's a new reality. So we're not just talking about economic recovery, we're talking about economic recovery plus transition. And that, of course, at the heart of the Commission's strategy is to say it will be a green recovery, it'll be a digital recovery, but that will be very challenging, will it not, to combine addressing the urgent basic needs for economic recovery with managing this transition at the same time. It's there in all the texts. Can it be done in reality?
Yeah, I think it is very challenging, but it is the reality. It is something we cannot avoid. We cannot envisage that we simply go back to the kind of behaviors, the kind of economic structures we had before the crisis. We have to make this transition, not only because it is the right thing to do, but also because globally we are going to see this transition. And that transition is the only chance we have in Europe to remain competitive, to remain at the forefront of economic development. Simply trying to go back to an outdated model is not going to work, also because in many sectors we're not going to have the same levels of demand or the same type of demand as we had before the crisis. I think we still don't know in many areas where things are going to land exactly, but we already can see that in areas such as transport, mobility, things are changing permanently. People are thinking differently. I think what we also need, and I think there the EU can have a leadership role, is we need to think about lock-in strategies. How can we make sure that the kind of advances we have made are going to be carried into the future? So how can we make sure that, for example, the enormous reduction in greenhouse gases we have seen because of reduced economic activity is locked in and doesn't just result in a return to polluting activity once the restrictions on the economy are loosened. So I think there's a lot more which needs to be done, and that also means we have to find ways of supporting that. I think we have done the right step in the right direction at the European level, but this is not enough. This is going to be a starting point. And for example, what I think we need to think about much more is not just the funding of this. That is important, but this is only a starting point, because in the end, it's private companies which will have to make this transition. So we need to find the regulatory framework. We need to find the overall environment which incentivizes and encourages this behavior.
Thank you very much. Janis, pick up on this if you will. And I wanted to raise one more point before we begin to delve into some of the issues more specifically. And this was the comments that President Van Rompuy made about Angela Merkel. He said it's an end of an era for the European Union. And he says, and I quote, "No one can take over that role today in the European Council." Number one, would you agree? And question then to all of you, does it matter that no one can play that role? Was it unique to its time and the circumstance and the personality, or do we need someone to take on that role? But Janis, please do react to the comments that were made on the new normal first. Lots of questions already coming in.
I'll try to refer to both these issues. I think the question which Herman raised is a very pertinent one. What will be left from this experience? And I think that a lot will be left from this experience. There is, we all know that, no way to go back to a status quo ante. This is not an option. And I think that what we have and are experiencing, because we're still in the middle of this crisis, is some fundamental changes where a lot will still remain with us whenever we get to this new normal, whatever it will look like. I think that what we're experiencing, and that's where it is so difficult to give a concrete answer as to what it will be, is some form of a cultural change. How we deal with communication, how we deal with transport, how we deal with interpersonal relationships. We are fundamentally being challenged by the crisis, and I think that this will have some long-lasting effects on all of us. This is why I use the word of a cultural change, which we're going to be witnessing. The question is, which of these things will we keep? Will we foster? Will we actually try to push forward even further a lot of the positive elements of the crisis which we are witnessing? So how we will determine what this new normal will look like will be extremely important, because it is still something which is to be determined. It's not going to be a given. And also how we will exploit the opportunities which are linked to this crisis. Because a lot of us are now aware of the negativeness of the crisis, but there are also a lot of opportunities. And how are we going to use that? Which obviously links also to the recovery phase. And yes, it needs to be a lot about climate, a lot about digital, but I think it also needs to have a strong social dimension. So this recovery triangle we've been talked about in the past. Now, with respect to Angela Merkel, yes, no one can take her role. She is the longest serving member of the European Council with a vast amount of experience. Her voice counts when she speaks in the European Council. And if you look over the past 6 months of the German presidency, a lot of the accomplishments of the German presidency would have not been possible, I would argue, without Angela Merkel pushing for different things which she felt were the key elements which should have get through during the German presidency, including the China investment deal. And so up till even the last week of the presidency, which she was pushing, she was behind a lot of things. So she cannot be easily replaced. But it's not the first time, by the way, that we're having a German chancellor being in office 16 years or almost 16 years, being replaced, a new German chancellor comes in. The person needs to get acquainted with how the EU works, needs to fill big footsteps. But the person, whoever it will be, and we do not know who the next German chancellor will be, we know that it won't be a woman, most likely. So the question is, how fast, at what pace will this person be able to not only become the German chancellor, but also play that strong roles which a German chancellor always plays in the European Council.
But also another question will be the impact of those upcoming elections in Germany, and indeed upcoming elections in France in 2022 in particular, as well as elections in other member states, of course, how much of an influence that will have on the debate, and will it make it harder this year to make the sort of bold decisions that were made last year. But Herman, you raised this point in your opening remarks. Does it matter that no one can replace her in that sense? Does the EU need an Angela Merkel figure, or is it simply, because we are maybe past the immediate intense phase of the crisis, can we manage without her, I suppose is what I'm asking.
Yeah, everybody is replaceable. So we are unique, but at the same time, we always have followers. That's a lesson of life. But we cannot have a good functioning European Union and a good functioning European Council without a strong Franco-German motor. And so you need strong personalities to bring the European Union further, and for sure in these strange times where we can always expect the unexpected. I saw that during my time in office. First we had Angela Merkel and Nicolas Sarkozy. Remember the Merkozy. So they were so strong together that they called them the Merkozy. And then came François Hollande, a very nice and intelligent man, but not a real leader. And so we saw then that the Franco-German motor was not functioning anymore. It changed. In the beginning it was difficult, but it changed with the coming of President Macron. And Chancellor Merkel and Macron worked very well together during this time. And remember the agreement in May between France and Germany on the 500 billion recovery fund, all by grants, by the way. So it ended with this compromise, but a compromise going strongly in the sense of the Franco-German agreement. So we need strong personalities, both in France and in Germany. But France alone cannot do the job.
Indeed.
We need a strong leadership in Germany. And I hope, as Janis said, that the successor of Angela Merkel, as it was the case in the past, will fill in that role.
Yeah.
But I'm not so sure that it will happen very soon.
Indeed.
And I'm not so sure it will happen in the same way.
On the other side of the strong leadership coin, we have a question from Gabriela Kovac saying, what do you think will be the pandemic's impact on leadership styles? Meaning, is it a turning point towards sacrificing democratic values through open discussion, freedom of expression, for example, for the authoritarian decision makers who stand in the role of a safeguarder of security? Herman, how do you see this? Because there's a lot of debate about, did countries with more authoritarian regimes do better in responding to the pandemic? Some people saying yes. When you have very firm decision making, a bit less democracy, they responded better. It started a debate about strong leadership of the negative kind. Your reaction to that, if you would, and then we'll move on.
Yeah, let's look at the global level. Of course, China is a good example of let's say, a strong and effective antivirus policy, although the virus started in China. But can you say the same thing about Russia? Can you say the same thing about Brazil or Iran? All authoritarian regimes. When you look at democracies in Korea, in Taiwan, even in the first wave in Japan, they had very, very good results. In Germany, by the way, in the first wave, it was quite impressive what they did. They were really an exception in the European Union. Under the leadership of President Trump, I will not call it authoritarian, but under his populist leadership, it was a disaster. It was completely a disaster. In some way, in the UK, it was a disaster with a populist government. So you have all kinds of analysis you could make, but it is too easy to say that the authoritarian regimes are working very well, and the democracies did a bad job.
Yeah.
The same about populist and non-populist regimes.
Absolutely. Janis, you wanted to come in, and then Fabian, I didn't give you a chance to comment on this Angela Merkel question, and then I'd like to start delving into some of the detail of what we're talking about. But Janis, you wanted to jump in here.
I want to echo and add some things to what Herman was saying with respect to how certain regimes, how certain governments were able or not able to cope with the health dimension of the crisis. I think we're seeing a very mixed picture. It's not as clear-cut to say it's the populists or the non-populists, the liberal Democrats who have done better or worse. I think that there are other factors which determine at the end of the day as to whether how member states were able to cope with the health dimension of the COVID crisis. One has to do how high or not is the trust in institutions. I think that is a key factor. If people trust in institutions is high, that helps in order to deal with the crisis. Second, do you trust and are you guided by expert knowledge? Do you believe what experts are telling you when they're telling you, for example, you need a harder lockdown in order to avoid a big second or third wave? Some listened, others didn't. I think that was determined the success. Experience with similar situations. If you look into South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, they have had experience with similar challenges, not the same, but similar challenges that help them. And often, and we also have to acknowledge that, and that also goes for my mother country, Germany, you also sometimes need to be lucky. And it always also luck plays a big role. So you cannot determine it's this or that regime or government who do a better job. It's much more complex.
Thank you. Fabian, a comment to the future without Merkel and a reaction to this discussion. And then I'd like to come back to the EU's COVID response and vaccinations in particular, because we have a comment related to that, and I have a question. Fabian.
I think this question of leadership and generally decision-making is also one of the questions we have to ask ourselves in terms of the new norm. What is actually a good way of dealing with uncertainty and risk. And that goes beyond dealing with a pandemic, with a health threat. That goes across many different areas. So, for example, I think one thing which has been highlighted by this crisis is that making contingency arrangements, making sure that there's capacity left when you're hitting crisis is extremely important. So maybe reviewing what we have done and how we have done it will also prepare us better for the next crisis, whatever type of crisis that might be. And I think we are still seeing that we're having some problems dealing with this current crisis. What seems to be the case now in many countries is that we only make decisions about more severe measures once we have seen that the figures are going bad. And that is actually too late. In many cases, we have already seen things coming, but we only reacted late. I would think mainly because politicians are afraid of putting action into place without having the backing of the figures already there. So I think these are things we have to look at to make decision-making more effective. But certainly leadership has a lot to do with trust. And I think that is the key lesson from this. It's about trust. And this is also where the link, I think, is to Angela Merkel and what is going to happen in Germany. there are many decisions people have disagreed with. There are many areas where people are not in line with what Angela Merkel has done. But generally, she's trusted. Even people in other countries have seen that she has been a steady hand,
Indeed.
which has also been defending the European interest. And now when we're looking at the candidates for leadership, it's not necessarily clear what their direction is going to be long term. I think people shouldn't be overly afraid that Germany will become Eurosceptic or that we will have a breakdown in the political system within Germany. That's not likely, but it's going to be a massive change for the whole of Europe because the role Merkel has played cannot be replaced by someone else.
Lots of questions coming in from the audience, and one more a comment, and I wanted to come to the question, the health issue, because we're tending to focus now on the post-pandemic world, the economic recovery and so on. A comment about this: we should be very careful in raising expectations, says Dimitri Korpakis. Vaccines will not have a meaningful impact until the first semester of 2022, and we should not forget that developing countries will not have the same access to vaccines as the Western world. All this means that the pandemic would not end until at least 2023. In such a context, crisis economics will have to continue. Just a reminder there, but could I come to the specifics of the health response? And Janis, perhaps I could ask you this. There is a suggestion and a lot of criticism at the moment, the European Commission under fire over the vaccine procurement programme, saying it's been too slow, it's been badly organised. There's criticism of the EU's speed of decision-making on the vaccines compared with, say, the UK or the US. Has the EU got it wrong? Is the criticism justified, or is this more cautious, careful approach, do you think, is there important reasons for it? Is it justified the way the Commission has approached this?
I think, well, first of all, you can always be critical of certain decisions which were taken or not taken over the past 8-9 months, but that goes for the European and also for the national level. I think the criticism which we're currently hearing, reading vis-a-vis the Commission has gone too far. I think that the Commission has tried its best in the purchase program to make sure that enough vaccines will be available for the entirety of the European Union. And that is something, and now they have added, just before we started our discussion today, the Commission von der Leyen announced new purchase of the BioNTech Pfizer vaccine. So they're adding also elements to the equations. But I think that it was very interesting because in Germany, for example, you had harsh criticism vis-a-vis the Commission. And in a meeting which Merkel had with the counterparts from the German Bundesländer, with the prime ministers of the German Bundesländer, she told them, let's not start having a discussion about what we did wrong, because we've done a lot of mistakes, and we have done a lot of mistakes also at national level. So now arguing it is the Commission's fault is extremely simplistic. And then they backtracked. And I think that the problems we're now facing is the distribution of vaccine is extremely difficult, especially with respect to the biotech vaccine, the Pfizer vaccine. The manufacturing is a bottleneck. And also the preparedness of member states to roll out the vaccination at the national level is another bottleneck.
So there are significant challenges, but Fabian, perhaps if I could come to you on this, a suggestion. Well, look, actually, each country should have gone it alone. This is the first, and don't get me started on the dishonesty of this, but this is the first Brexit dividend. We were able to approve it faster than everybody else because we weren't hidebound by the EU. Even the UK agency that did the approving says that's not true. But nevertheless, some people in Germany saying we should have gone it alone. We shouldn't have done it through the EU. How do you respond to that?
I think when we're looking at the response in the UK, I mean, clearly this is part of the kind of negative nationalism agenda I was talking about. Clearly it was nonsense because these approvals took place while the UK was still in the transition period. So the UK was still bound by all of the European regulations which were there. It was an individual decision by a member state, which could have driven this. So in a sense, also Germany could have done things differently. And I think it's always easy to look at things with hindsight and to say, but we would have done it much better if we had only not been part of the European Union at that point. I think the reality is these are incredibly difficult decisions. I am sure we are going to be reviewing these decisions over many years to come, and there will also be mistakes which have been made. But I would question whether these are really systemic mistakes or whether these are mistakes which happen in the moment. And we are now seeing a movement. And then to some extent, we always knew this process is going to take time. The vaccinations are not happening overnight. There have to be very difficult decisions about what are the priority groups which get vaccinated. How do we make sure that we weigh up between different types of vaccines, some of which have to be cooled, some of which don't have to be cooled. So I think we're going to see that process working out, and it's not going to be smooth at all times. But the important thing is that we are starting now. And that's something where I think member states actually have to look at themselves rather than the European Union. A lot of the holdup now has to do with national systems about how you distribute these vaccines, who is going to administer it, how you actually get people notified that they have the right to get the vaccine, etc.
And indeed,
there's a lot of misinformation. Some people are promising things which they cannot fulfill. That has nothing to do with the European Union. That's the national level.
But as you say, the Netherlands Prime Minister, Mark Rutte, yesterday saying we didn't get this right. So saying nationally we have got this wrong. Can I turn to the external agenda for a moment? Because there's a question, Herman, from Paul Taylor. You praised the EU-China agreement. It has come under strong criticism for containing no binding obligations on China to change its behavior, no enforcement mechanisms, and being a strategic victory for Xi Jinping's aggressive divide and rule diplomacy. What makes you think this was the right deal at the right time? You said it was a good thing. Why do you believe that's true?
Let us not forget that each free trade agreement is under heavy criticism. I recall the TTIP negotiations with the United States, which were rejected by large parts of public opinion before the negotiation actually started. I recall the Mercosur agreements concluded by the Commission. There's heavy criticism on it in France, in other countries, also in the European Parliament. So a free trade agreement is always an agreement that is controversial. On the EU-China, we started the process, and I'm co-responsible with the President of the European Commission at that time. I started the process in 2013. So we negotiated, not all the time with the same in the same spirit, but we negotiated during 7 years. So we concluded this, and the original aim was to show that you can bring China to concessions on market access, on non-discrimination, without waging a trade war. So trying to solve the problems via dialogue in the true spirit of multilateralism. And this is quite a success because we achieved a lot of things that we are aiming for during years and years, and we achieved it via a conversation and in an agreement. France, which was, let's say, much more skeptical than other countries, is now supporting the deal, because if you have noticed that in the conversation between the Chinese President Charles Michel, Ursula von der Leyen, and Angela Merkel, Emmanuel Macron was there too. So it's very important that France is also supportive of this agreement. Of course, there are other issues related to the agreement as concerning human rights, and it's always a difficult exercise. What should be the true link between human rights protection and trade agreements, knowing that, and I speak from experience in all these, that big countries, you will not change really their mind and their policies via that kind of agreements. You have to raise the problem to bring the process a step further, but they have their own agenda, unfortunately. So we can put sufficient pressure, and I think in the agreement there are now articles that put pressure on China, but at the end of the day, they will make their own decisions about what's happening inside their country. We have again to raise the topic, to put sufficient pressure, but not the price should not be that we have no trade relations with China anymore, or we cannot conclude trade or other agreements with China at all. So this would put China in an isolated position. It's going against our interest, but it's also against, let's say, more geopolitical interests. So saying no to each agreement is the most easy thing you can do. So I think this is a step forward, not only in economic terms, that's a huge step forward, but it is also a step forward in terms of protection of human rights. It's not the ideal world, but it is again making progress in this difficult field.
Thank you. Janis, you wanted to come in, a brief one if you would, lots of questions coming in. I want, while we're talking external relations, as it is an external relations issue now, to come also back on the topic of Brexit, and then there's lots of questions, but quick one if you would, Janis.
Just a quick addition. What we witnessed at the end of this year with respect to the EU-China investment deal was a political endorsement. So there's still some way to go. There still is an official need for an official approval from the side of the governments. The European Parliament still needs to approve it. And there are two main directions of criticism. One is as to whether the investment deal addresses human rights issues, especially with respect to workers' rights. And the second issue is, was this the right timing? I expect that with respect to the first issue, does it address human rights issues? There still will be a strong discussion. This is where the European Parliament will also has already raised its voice and will be raising its voice. So we'll see in which direction that will go. And with respect to, was this the right timing? Obviously, this was related to the new US administration coming to power in now 12 days. So was this the right signal to give towards the Biden administration? And we will see. What is sure is that we will have strong discussions with the new US administration on our relationship with China, and that will be one of the tests which we, not only in 21, but also far beyond that, will have to undergo as European as to how we will deal in our relationship with China and with the US and in terms of the triangle.
Okay, thank you. I want to come on to the issue of Brexit because, in fact, I was very struck by what President Van Rompuy said, Fabian, when he was talking about the EU's ambitions to be a geopolitical actor. And he said, in this area, and in the question of strategic autonomy, this isn't somewhere where we're going to miss our British friends. They would have held us back. A striking remark there. Just in terms of Brexit, I would like to know what you think the way forward is now. We got that deal at the very 11th hour, spoilt many people's Christmases, having co-repairs on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day and Boxing Day, extraordinary stuff. Before I bring you in though, John Palmer had his hand raised and I have half an instinct it might be about Brexit, so let's lump them together if we can. John, was it about Brexit? Please unmute yourself if it was.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you beautifully. Away you go.
Directly about Brexit, but it is indirectly. I'd like to ask the panel whether they think the COVID experience, the trauma, throws a new light, or doesn't, on the positive prospects for the Convention on the Future of Europe. Are there issues on that agenda which may be looked at in a new light, perhaps potentially a more positive light, and if so, which ones?
Thank you very much. I'll come back on that on a moment, if I might, because just staying with this, because we've also got another question on the Convention of the Future of Europe. But Fabian, on Brexit and on where we go from here, it's a skinny deal. It is, of course, only provisionally applied at the moment. Let's not forget the European Parliament still has to scrutinise and approve it, and they're going to take their time to do that. But where can we go from here? Where can there be? Do you believe we have a basis to build better cooperation? This is, of course, something the EPC is working on. You have a specific project on this issue. Where do we go from here? Same question to you and to Herman Van Rompuy, and then I'll come back on the Convention of the Future of Europe to Janis. Fabian.
I mean, I think firstly, we should note that it's good that we have a deal. The alternative would have been much worse. And that we wouldn't expect that this is going to fall at the late hour. The Parliament will scrutinize it, but unless they find something which no one else has spotted yet, I don't see any chance that we will not implement this deal. It is a deal which in some ways falls short. It falls short in relation to what we had in the political declaration. It falls short in terms of the ambitious dreams, if you like, which were there at the beginning, that we would have a strong integration, both politically and economically, with the UK post-Brexit. But when we actually look at it in comparison to the mandate, which was given to Barnier, it fulfills all of the points in the mandate. So in many ways, from a European perspective, it is the best possible deal we could have had, given the red lines of the UK government of leaving the single market, leaving the customs union. But we now need to move on from the deal, and we need to look towards the longer term. And you referred to our project on track 2 negotiations, which is exactly about that, is how do we cooperate in the post-Brexit world in all the issues, not just the economic relationship, but also in areas such as foreign and security policy, such as the environment, climate change. There are many different areas where there's a need to cooperate. And I agree with Herman, there are some decisions within the European Union which will become easier because there will not be an objection from the UK. But there are also some capacities, some capabilities we are losing with the UK. Where we will have to see who is going to step up to the plate. The UK is one of the major security actors within Europe. So we need to see how we are going to deal with that and how we cooperate. And this is the point Malcolm Harbour raised. We shouldn't forget that the UK still has an international role. For example, the UK will be hosting COP26 this year. And this is one of the areas where I think we should have a Western response, if you like, a Western strategy of what we want to achieve. And that has to be discussed now. It has to be discussed between the UK and the EU, then bringing in also the new administration in the US. But these are areas where cooperation will benefit both sides. And the key question now is whether politically Boris Johnson wants to have a cooperative arrangement, wants to discuss these issues, or whether this emphasis on divergence, on wanting to do things differently, will be carried through into the post-Brexit phase.
As usual, when it comes to the British Prime Minister, very hard to know what precisely he wants. But Herman, to that point about how we build cooperation now, could you react to that? And also on this question, Fabian was referring there to a question from Malcolm Harbour, where he asks, might the COP26 be an opportunity for the UK to establish its credibility as a global actor? You said you feared Brexit would be the last geopolitical act of Great Britain in its history. It's now about the survival of the UK itself. Fairly dramatic talk. Do you think it can play a leadership role, or is it doomed to turn inwards as it deals with the aftermath of Brexit now?
Yes, the location of COP conferences is, let's say, and that's a coincidence. It's happening in the UK, by the way, in Scotland. But that's a coincidence. That's not emphasizing the geopolitical role of the UK. You had COP conferences in Mexico, in Poland, in France, in so many other countries. So this is not really something special for me. It's simply a coincidence. And the last time in Paris, the big agreement was an agreement between the Obama administration, between China and the European Union. And this will not change. And with the new Biden administration, if the COP conference in Glasgow is a success, it will be a success if there is a cooperation between those three main actors. And the British government can play, and the British presidency can play a facilitating role, as Laurent Fabius did in France in December 2015. But that's not geopolitical. That's simply fulfilling the role they will have during that kind of conference. So I simply repeat what I said for the big agenda for the upcoming years on strategic autonomy, because that is now a key concept for the European Union in all kinds of areas: migration, the digital, strategic sectors, pharmaceuticals, and so on and so on. So in many areas, there it's about what we call European sovereignty. If you stress all the time national sovereignty, it's just incompatible. So we will not miss them. And we saw it also right after the referendum. We started working much more closely on European defense after June 2016. Then the so-called PESCO, the Permanent Structural Cooperation on Defense, was made possible. And you will see it also in many other areas.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Janis, the Conference on the Future of Europe. Question from Adam Isaacs. What, if anything, can we expect from the Conference on the Future of Europe? John Palmer, as we heard, they're saying, does COVID throw a more positive light on the prospects for the conference? And a sort of related question, just to throw them in as we don't have a lot of time, from Martin Nijholt, who says, what do you expect from cooperation on the between European health systems in the future? What role will the European Health Union play in solving the actual crisis in the longer term? I throw that in here because that, of course, one of the issues that's already been signaled by Angela Merkel, among others, she wants to see discussed at the conference. So I've thrown them all together. What are the prospects now, and when will it get underway? And by the way, is speculation that Michel Barnier might find a new role and a more positive role than he has had to endure for the last 4 years as chair of the conference? Is that going anywhere?
Well, first of all, obviously, the conference is being affected by COVID-19 in so many ways because of the significance of the crisis and the effects it's having, but also in terms of the effects it's having on the ground, in terms of having the ability of people meeting, which they are thought to be coming together in the context of the conference. So it is having a strong effect. I think it was a big pity that during the German presidency, there was no agreement found to launch the conference. The Chancellor tried, but we didn't get to an agreement for a good number of reasons, mostly related to leadership and governance issues, and mostly related to the fact that there were other issues, especially in December, on the agenda, which were more important. But it was a pity that no agreement was found, because that would also have been a strong sign to not only to get it started, but to get it started during the German presidency, which also would have meant that the political system in Germany, the Chancellery, and whoever will follow Merkel will also have this burden on their back of we started the conference and we want this to end in a very positive way. So the question of political ownership. Now, I think one thing which is going to be, and that's where there is a strong link to COVID-19, what will determine whenever the conference starts, we'll see when the Portuguese presidency and other institutions will be able to strike a deal on the leadership and governance question. One key question will be, what shall the conference actually deal with? And the biggest problem will be if it deals with everything and nothing at the same time. So more is less, which by the way was a logic which Angela Merkel, while being at the helm of the council, was also attributing and saying that this is something where we should concentrate on the things which we believe are significant. And obviously, issues related to the health sector, the European Health Union, is something which 2 years ago we wouldn't have thought about. But linking to what we were discussing in the beginning, I believe that the conference should concentrate on the main transformational issues we are dealing with. Health is one, but it's also the green, the digital, Europe's global role, and the future of democracy, especially European democracy. These are, for me, the 4 or 5 main issues. That doesn't mean that the conference should not discuss also and deal with other issues, but this is the main issues it should discuss. And I hope that when we get to the point that the conference starts, and we will have a leadership in place, that leadership will have the guts to say, we want to concentrate on the following issue. And I think that would be the right thing to do. And then there are other many challenges which will have to be dealt with, but I won't go into detail.
Okay,
With respect to Michel Barnier, my sense, and I'm not sure whether I'm right on this, but my sense is that he might be more inclined to concentrate on France itself. He has played now a strong role at the European level. He has been acknowledged for the role he has played. Everyone has praised him for the role that he has played. So he might want to take that capital back to his home country in order to play a role in 2022.
Thank you very much indeed. A couple of economic related questions coming in from the audience, one a broad one and one quite a specific one. The broad one from Jakob Langvad. The change in German economic orthodoxy and thinking as expressed in the Corona budget and EU loan taking, that dramatic decision and shift by Germany, will it survive Merkel? That's the big question. And Sorcha Edwards, I have your question now in writing, but you've had your hand up for a long time. So if you would still perhaps like to put it to us orally, Sorcha, can you unmute yourself? Hello?
Yes, hello.
Hello, go fire away, and apologies for keeping you waiting so long.
No problem at all. Thanks a lot and Happy New Year. Thanks for the really inspiring conversation. I just wanted to refer back to the comment made on household debt, because we are seeing an increasing number of articles talking about the increase of 10% in the last quarter of 2020 in household savings. And I wondered if you see any potential there. So I'm coming from the social housing sector, and in France, there is actually a ring fencing of saving, voluntary, of course, ring fencing of people's savings for the investment in social housing, which has been in place for decades, if not a century. So I wonder if you saw an opportunity there for to promote solidarity between segments of the society who've been really badly hit compared to segments who are actually doing rather well, at least in terms of their savings.
Thank you very much, Sorcha. And if I could add to that, just again, in the interest of time, Fabian, come to you perhaps first this time. We haven't talked much about the Portuguese presidency, but one of the key agenda items, priorities for the Portuguese presidency is the social dimension of recovery. We have the social summit coming up in May. We're expecting an action plan on the implementation of the European Pillar of Social Rights. A reaction, please, on all of those together, if you can, just in the interest of time. So the first question, just to remind you, was about this change in Germany economic orthodoxy. Will it survive? Then that question relating to household debt, and the broader, my question about the social agenda.
I think it's very difficult to predict where the public debate is going to go in Germany. It already changed before the crisis, so there were already dissenting voices on the orthodoxy, but it's also a very persistent part of German thinking, and in part it will depend on the personalities. The different candidates for leadership of the CDU, the leader of the CSU, they all have different takes on this and would take a different tack. But there's also an underlying reality, and the underlying reality is that Germany is not keeping to the orthodoxy in light of the crisis, and it cannot. So for the foreseeable future, we are going to have debt-financed spending in countries, not just in Europe, as Herman was already mentioning. This is something which is happening right across the world. So I think, in a sense, what we're going to see is quite a lot of pragmatism. It's going to be about what needs to be done now to face the new challenges the crisis brings up. One of the major challenges this crisis is going to bring up is the social dimension. And I think here we really should be emphasizing it more, not as an afterthought, but as something which is integral to the response to the crisis, because the distributional consequences of this crisis are enormous. This will not hit all the groups in society, all countries, all regions equally. This will have a very differentiated impact on different parts of the European Union, on different parts of our societies. And we have to deal with that in a much more comprehensive way than we have done up to now. Frankly, what we have done up to now has very often been that we have looked at the response and then we've tagged on the social dimension at the end. This time around, I think we need to start with the social dimension as being part of the major transformations we are seeing now, because if we don't address it properly, the other transformations are not going to happen. We're not going to be able to get our economies in the direction of, for example, more sustainability, because populations are not going to accept it. So this is an integral part. What exactly the instruments are, I think there's a lot more we need to think about, also because the social dimension in many cases is still something where the competences of the member states are still much stronger. So when we're talking about social housing, for example, this is not something I can see happening at the European level, because we are simply not going to have the transfer of competences. However, what should happen at the European level is that we look at our debt rules, our fiscal rules, that we look at our frameworks in which this happens, and that we look at the European semester and see how we can enable these kind of activities to happen, also with a view of the recovery instrument of the European budget, to make sure that the spending which is coming through these routes can be used for social investment.
Thank you. Herman, a comment. It was very striking that the Portuguese presidency's motto, time to deliver, talks, and it uses this word first, a fair, green and digital recovery. Fabian saying there, if it isn't perceived as fair, you won't get the rest of it. Would you agree with that? And what would you expect to come out of the social summit this year and this increased emphasis? Will it be something that really stops being the afterthought and becomes more integral to the whole recovery process?
I said on many occasions that social cohesion is one of the 2 or 3 main targets for national governments and also for the European Union. By the way, when we speak about the Next Generation Recovery Fund, the aim is to give the money in the first place to those who are most hit by the crisis. So there is a social dimension in the recovery fund. There is a strong dimension of solidarity in the recovery fund. So it's not only about future orientation, climate change, digital, but there is also this concern about rising inequalities inside the European Union. By the way, they started also before the crisis. During the pandemic, you saw new inequalities rising between those who can telework, work on distance, and those who only can work physically on the spot. And so the first group, of course, is in a much stronger position. You will see after the crisis that those with low skills will be much more hit by the consequences of the pandemic than those with higher skills. And all this, and I said also in my introduction, it has also now a political dimension, because populism is not only based on migration, it's also based on inequalities. And one of the strange things in the American elections is that those who are most poor are voting for a very rich man as Donald Trump. But in some way, he managed to capture the frustrations and all those negative feelings of parts of the especially the white population that is getting poor and feel that they are abandoned by the economy, by the system, and by politics in general. So if we want to contain populism in Europe, we have to be much more concerned about inequalities, the old ones before Pandora and the new ones. Yeah. And as Fabian said, it's mainly a task of the national governments and even inside federal states that there are also big competencies for lender or for federal entities. But there is also a European dimension. And by the way, the social pillar, so dear to the heart of Jean-Claude Juncker, if you look at the objectives, most of it has to be implemented by national governments.
Absolutely. The point about competences again. Janis, you wanted to come on in this, and then I want to come back. There's a question about the Pact on Migration Asylum, and then we'll try and draw some conclusions. But Janis, you wanted to come in on this social issue, I think.
Yes, exactly. The question is, how far will we get into 2021 in terms of actual deeds and not only nice words? So trying to implement the pillar on social rights is nice to say, but actually, how does it translate into real action on the ground at the European and the national level? And I think we will see that this will be a test, because in order to move forward with respect to next generation EU, every member state will have to come up with national recovery and resilience plans. These have to be judged by the Commission. There will be a decision which the Council will take. So there is then room to really prove as to whether social is not, as Fabian was saying, an afterthought, but is actually part of the recovery triangle. So we're concentrating on climate, we're concentrating on the digital, but the social dimension is equally significant. And how is that then mirrored in the national plans which are being put forward by member states? And how is it mirrored in decisions from the Commission and the Council in terms of actually where the money should be going to? And it's a lot of money we're talking about, which will have an effect, especially in the countries most hit by the crisis. So there is actually a way to prove as to whether you're taking the social as significantly as you're actually saying that in Sunday speeches. And by the way, there's also discussion going on of how you define social and how you define well-being beyond GDP. That's something to mirror, which potentially the Portuguese are indicating that they want to move in that direction. It's something to see as to whether that is actually going to be mirrored in political reality.
Very much.
Just a short remark on the German.
Very short.
On the German elections. Fabian is right. It is important to see who will be the next chancellor in order to then judge as to what the German attitude will be on issues like, for example, orthodoxy when it comes to economic policy making, but it's also what coalition government will be in place. And if you ask me now, the chances are highest that it will be a black and green coalition. And if it's the Greens who are part of that coalition, that is going to be significant with respect also to this orthodoxy.
Fabian, you wanted, but I'm going to get one sentence, if you would, on this, and I want to briefly come to the new Pact on Migration and Asylum.
So I just wanted to pick up something Herman said on a different topic, but I think it's important because we haven't really commented on what has been happening in the US for the last couple of days. I suspect that's because we all agree on the condemning what has happened. But it does show that despite the positive developments and despite the optimism which we can also have, and it should be noted that the capture of the Senate by the Democrats is a very important step because it gives President Biden a much greater leeway in terms of his policy direction. But what we still see is that there's an underlying division, an underlying polarization within the American society. And this is also something we're still seeing in many European countries. So we shouldn't lose sight of these divisions. There was a poll which suggested that 20% of the American people, but more than half of Republican voters actually supported the riots, which is a shocking amount.
Indeed, so lessons for Europe from all of that as we watch this unfold in America. Herman, just one quick one, if you would. You said there was a long way to go on the Pact for Migration and Asylum. Alexander Maliv says, how would you assess the new pact? Your thoughts, and in a couple of minutes, less if you can, only on the chances of getting a deal. This was a very difficult issue last time around. It looks like being no easier this time around. Can that gap be bridged? Can we get agreement, do you think?
I'm not an expert at all in these matters. I think that the Commission made a clever proposal, trying to circumvent some traps and also very creative in finding new forms of so-called solidarity. But the first reactions were not so negative. They became much more negative later on. But still, migration is although we speak now about corona, pandemics, health, and so on, but migration is still very high on the political agenda of most people. And once that the pandemic is over or is less acute, migration will come back. And it's one of the most divisive topics in national politics. And so the national governments and leaders are very cautious when it's all about, when they speak about migration or try to conclude about migration at the European level. It is not only Hungary and Poland versus the rest. It's not only so-called East and West, although the East is also not a homogeneous concept. But they are also inside the North and the South. There are big differences. And in the South, of course, Greece and Italy, and to some extent Spain, are also asking solidarity even much more than the northern parts of Europe. So it's a complicated issue. And if there are elections, as in the Netherlands, for instance, in a few months, and in other countries, then there's the tendency to not give in, and to show as less solidarity as possible. It will be very strong on the national political agenda. So I don't see, to make a long story short, I don't see much progress. The only progress we can make is to protect us better.
Yeah.
So that's my last word, Jacki. The more protection we have, so-called protection, and there is also a lot of discussion about it, the less solidarity we need, because we have not on to redistribute or to relocate or to resettle people. So I only see about the chapter of protection more progress, but on solidarity, unfortunately,
not the time. Sorry, Janis,
and not so hopeful.
Can't bring you in on this point. We have 3 minutes left. So in 1 minute each, and it's a very unfair question as always, but I want to come back. Herman said at the beginning, at the end of his opening remarks, hope is not forbidden. I like the way you put it. He said, ask Joe Biden, hope is not forbidden. So for each of you, I'll start with Fabian, go to Janis, and last word to Herman, 1 minute each. If we are to ensure that over the next 6 months, over the course of 2021 more generally, that hope can be realized, that we can build on some of the positives that have come out of COVID that Herman talked about right at the beginning, but also address those terrible negatives, not just in health consequences, but also in economic consequences, in social consequences. What for each of you is the most important thing we can do at the European level over the next 12 months to make sure that hope, if we allow ourselves to hope, is realized? Fabian, Janis, then Herman.
Very brief, but I won't answer your question exactly.
You might not.
I think the most important thing we have to actually deal with is that we have to get out of the thinking that all of this is exceptional and that we will return to some form of normal at some point in time. This is how the world looks like, and it's going to look like for a number of years. It might not be COVID crisis, it might not be exactly what we are facing at the moment, but the exceptional is going to become the normal, and we are going to have to deal with a radically different world. So we need to also continue to develop our decision-making, our thinking. We need to get better at anticipating what is coming up. And we need to get better in translating the goals we have, the objectives we have, into a reality which is felt on the ground. I think the demise of the European Union, which has been predicted by many people over many years, is not going to be imminent. We are going to continue to be there, and there has been a lot of stability, but we need to adapt to these new challenges.
I'm very relieved to hear that in 2021 we have an optimistic note from Mr. Zuleeg to end our update. As he said earlier, not always known for his optimism, but a more positive take than perhaps sometimes. Janis, briefly, if you would. Positive or negative?
It's the beginning of the year, so also going to be positive. But jokes aside, I think hope is not forbidden is correct. But I think that also analytically, if you look at where we are and what we've gone through over the past 10 years, with 10 months, sorry, with all the ups and downs of the crisis, as we said in the beginning, The development could have been much worse. Imagine if we would have not have the ECB reacting as quickly as it did, if there would have not been an agreement on the Next Generation EU Recovery Fund, if we would have, all these things would have not happened, where we would be now. So it's not only that hope is not forbidden, I think that there's reason to be hopeful. Now, there's not one thing which you need to do, and that's the silver bullet which will help us. I think it's the basic attitude we need to have, the right basic attitude we need to have. And for me, that relates to the fact that we need to prepare ourselves for the post-19 realities.
Yeah.
And that for me is, the important thing is that we take up and we have a thorough discussion about that, because we actually haven't had that discussion up till now, of what actually we want to keep as lessons for the future. What are the opportunities we want to exploit? And that goes for the European level, it goes for the national level and the subnational level. So this basic attitude of preparing for post-19 realities in a positive way, not only in a negative way, despite all the challenges we will be facing also in 21 and probably also 22.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Herman, you have the last word.
Thank you. I said hope is not forbidden, but in other speeches, I always say hope is also a verb. So you have to work on your own hope, so to speak. I very much agree with Janis when he said that much will depend on the attitude. So what I hope is that the spirit of solidarity and cooperation we saw during the pandemic at the European level, but also at the national level. In my country, all federal entities, so the regions, the communities, and the federal government worked hand in hand during 9 months, never seen. And you have also the same phenomenon in other countries. But you have it, of course, you had it at the European level, that this spirit of cooperation and solidarity will not be lost once that the height of the crisis of the pandemic is over. And that something will remain, that there is a legacy of it, because otherwise, a lot of things that should be happen after the pandemic, because the challenges, as Fabian said, are high, will not be realized. We have to continue with the spirit of solidarity and cooperation. I know it seems a little bit as the blessing of the pastor at the end of the Mass, but I sincerely put this emphasis on values and on attitude.
Thank you very much. And thank you to all three of you. And thank you for ending our first update of the year on such a positive note. Many challenges ahead, but much to build on, as you've all said, in the next year. That's all we have time for today. Just to flag up, yesterday, the EPC published a paper on strategic autonomy. Please do take a look. And there'll be one today on how to improve foreign policy. Events next week on Tuesday, two to flag up to you, strengthening European, I seem to have the strange word there, I'm not sure what I've written there, but it's about a European Agency for Citizenship Education. And also on Tuesday, the road to Glasgow and COP26. We touched on it during our discussion. They'll focus on it. And on Thursday, we didn't have as much time for the external agenda as I would have liked, but one crucial issue, of course, for the coming months, re-engaging Iran towards a transatlantic approach. And Fabian, Janis and I will be back here in a couple of weeks' time for our next update. But let me thank all of you again for joining us, and thank you for your questions and comments. We got through most of them. There are a couple I didn't have time for, but thank you so much for that. Thank you for being with us. Thank you to all three of you, but most particularly, thank you very much, Mr. President, for joining us again, for your thoughts, for your wisdom and your insights. And let us hope, as you say, that that spirit of cooperation grows and is built on over the coming year. Thank you all very much and have a great weekend and stay safe. Bye-bye.